Chapter 6, The Elf Story. And here's a picture of, we've got a little wooden soldier here, and this is the doorway to Elfton, where the elves live, and you'll hear about that. It was December 23rd, and that was the night when the official storytelling began. Holly was excited. She couldn't help it. It was an overwhelming experience every year. The storytelling brought in folks from the entire region of the North Pole, and some who flew in from as far away as Russia, China, Australia, and Florida, and New York on the U.S. mainland. These were the people who wanted to hear the stories of the season and to celebrate giving. They wanted to participate in something extraordinary and to instill the concept of joy of giving in their children. This was a time of touching and reaching out and listening, and it was fun. Look, everyone, Nikki, they're all laughing and smiling just the way it should be. You're right, little star, he replied, but there is some concern about the weather. While some of the Santas and their family have arrived, most have not. I know it always snows this time of year, but a blizzard has been brewing all day, and predictions are that it will get worse over the next few days. Holly looked around and could see people occasionally glancing out the windows before turning to talk again. Still, spirits were high, and there was not yet a great deal of concern. But, Nikki, Holly assured her cousin, there has never been a cancellation of Christmas celebration, not even during the terrible fog when Rudy joined the Slate team eons ago. Nikki laughed again. You're right as always, Holly. Now let's listen to your papa's wonderful storytelling. They left the great room, which is where people were busy talking and eating, and went into the large sitting room where the fireplace was blazing. Papa was in his rocking chair on the hearth, and everyone was settling in. The children formed a half circle on the floor just in front of Papa, waiting expectantly. Come here, Andy. Come on, come on, come on. This is my Christmas boy here. He has to get in on the story. Come on, right here. You're all right. Papa always began with a little history of what he called, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. They left the great room, which is where people were busy talking and eating, and went into the large sitting room where the fireplace was blazing. Papa was in his rocking chair on the hearth, and everyone was settling in. The children formed a half circle on the floor just in front of Papa, and waiting expectantly. He told such good stories. That's my husband. Papa always began with a little history of what he called a great line of storytellers. He warms the people up, he always said, so they settled down and prepared to listen. Papa began. I am, as many of you know, the 20th North Pole Santa, the 20th in a long line of storytellers. With that, he launched into a trip down memory lane, telling of being a child sitting on his own father's knee, where he learned about the long line of North Pole Santas and their storytelling abilities. Storytellers, Papa said, don't just read stories or repeat words. They bring stories to life using their voices, their facial expressions, and through gestures. And then Papa made a big flourish in the air with his hands, making everyone laugh. That's my husband. Even when he isn't telling the Christmas stories, he's a great storyteller, Holly thought. But Papa continued, what really makes my stories special is that they are always, he repeated, true stories. There's no reason to make up stories when true ones are so good, Papa laughed. That's why they're so easy to tell. He stopped and looked slowly around the room and into the eyes of each child that sat in front of him. Well, by golly, if you all don't look like you want to hear a story, Papa shouted, causing all the children to cheer. Papa slapped his legs and nearly jumped out of the rocker. All right then, let's start with one of Holly's favorites. And seeing Holly, he gave her a wink, touched his finger to the side of his nose, and began. Come on. Gather close, little ones, because this story is for you, especially if you haven't heard it before. The children crowded onto the floor, warmed by the fireplace, and sat perfectly still, waiting to hear stories from the most famous of all storytellers, Holly's Papa. Being a good storyteller, Papa knew that the children must not only listen, but they must participate in the story to make it exciting for them. So he said, "Those of you who have heard the stories before must help me to tell the story from time to time. If I forget something, you must fill in the blank," he told them, and a great yay went up among the children already knowing the stories. That's how Papa involved all the children in his storytelling, and the parents were appreciative of this gift. The story I'm going to tell first is about the elves, the official Christmas. And Papa paused as if trying to remember a word, and suddenly half the children yelled out, "Toy makers!" And Papa responded, "Toy makers? Yes, of course. How could I forget? Toy makers." The children were roaring with excitement now, some because they already knew the story, the rest because they wanted to know the story. So Papa began the story in his very own way, occasionally forgetting a very important word, which would be filled in by the children who had heard the stories before and were excited to be a part of telling it again. The very first North Pole Santa, Papa began, came to the Arctic region somewhere near North Pole many, many years ago. In fact, it was 20 generations ago, and that's a very long time since, as you know, Santas live very, very long lives. The very first North Pole Santa decided to move to the North Pole because the magic reindeer lived nearby. And you all know the magic reindeer are very important to Santa. The Arctic is very cold, so not much lives there. But the magic reindeer must live in the region because that's where they get their magic ability to... And the children, knowing the story, yelled out, "Fly!" And Papa responded, "Fly? Why, yes, of course." Then Papa asked the children, "Do you know any other reindeer that can fly?" And they all shook their heads, indicating that they did not. Papa always asked that question, so that the children realized how special it was that the magic reindeer could fly, while other deer do not. Then he continued his story. North Pole Santa decided that the magic reindeer needed to be taken care of all year round. And since they could not live anywhere else, it was only natural that they should go live with them. So he and his young wife, that was the first one. That wasn't me, sorry. That was the first North Pole Santa. So he and his young wife moved to the Arctic. Of course, they really hadn't realized just how cold it was, but they were young, willing, and eager. Later, though, North Pole Santa and his wife moved a little further south where it wasn't quite as cold, but where the magic reindeer could live too. And that's actually North Pole, Alaska, just for your information. It wasn't long after North Pole Santa's arrival that he learned of some odd little characters that lived beneath the deep, deep ice of the North Pole. At this, some of the children started to look frightened, while the ones already knowing the story were nearly bouncing off the floor because they knew they would get a chance to yell out what Papa would conveniently forget. Papa went on with the story, watching their excitement building. Because of their strange appearance, they had eyes that were perfectly round, way too large for their small faces, toes that curled up to a point, and ears that really looked like they belonged on an elephant. The people of the region made fun of them. Does that surprise you? Papa stopped here and looked at the children and added, "And that is not a nice thing to do, is it?" And the children all shook their heads and quietly said, "No, Santa." And Papa continued, "So these elves," the children yelled, and Papa repeated, "Yes, elves, as they call themselves, created their own community below the ice. In fact, excuse me, They lived below the ice for so long that they built a complete community, dozens of feet below the surface. They seldom were required to come out and didn't except to gather food stores and trade. While the people ridiculed these elves for their appearance, no one faulted their toy-making skills. The elves were wonderful toy makers. They could fulfill any request with great skill. It was through a chance discovery of an almost lifelike toy soldier that the elves had made that North Pole Santa developed a friendship that would go beyond his own lifetime and into future generations of Santas. Living so far from civilization, North Pole Santa wasn't exactly sure how to get the toys he needed for the children of the believing world at Christmas. At a time when he was getting quite concerned about the situation, he saw a brightly colored toy soldier towering above him in the sky. He was quite startled when he first saw it. The tall soldier looked as if he was ready to march across the frozen tundra. "Where on earth did you come from?" North Pole Santa asked the soldier. "Could you really have marched here?" Suddenly, North Pole Santa heard a giggle, and then another, coming from an ice cave that opened only a few feet from the soldier. Taking a few large steps, he bent down and peeked into the cave, where to his utter amazement, he discovered two tiny, tiny children with some very large eyes, elephant-like ears, and a high-pitched, contagious laugh. The listening children simply couldn't contain themselves now and blurted out, "It was the elves!" And Papa just grinned and continued the story. Before he could say anything, they came bounding out of the ice cave, nearly knocking North Pole Santa to the ground. They were jumping and bubbling over with glee until North Pole Santa finally got them settled down enough to answer some questions, like, "Who are you? Where do you live? And where did this toy soldier come from?" After answering North Pole Santa's questions, the children went back into the cave, which was actually an entrance into their underground community. North Pole Santa was not allowed to go in, but the children assured him that they would bring their parents out, and that they did. In short order, North Pole Santa was surrounded by strange little characters whose parents were not much bigger than the children themselves, and whose curiosity matched his own. "Well, you know the rest of the story," Papa said to the children, and they all shook their heads up and down in unison. The elves had been official toy makers for Christmas ever since. Sounding quite final, Papa waited to see that he had everyone's attention before adding, "Now, if you want to know, as most children do, about the elves' underground town called Elfton, why, that is another story altogether." Then he laughed, knowing that, of course, they'd want to hear that one too. So the stories continued. It was a wonderful time for everyone, especially the children, which included many of the children of the townfolk. The evening passed quickly, and before anyone was ready, it was time to go. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve Day, children, a busy time for the elves and for the Santa Claus family. Sweet dreams, children. And Papa nodded his head, touched his finger to the side of his nose, and quietly left the room. The children, worn out by the day's activities, were hustled away by their parents for a good night's rest. And the children did indeed have sweet dreams, filled with memories that would live with them forever. And that's the end of chapter 6.